Hello YouTube, welcome back to Kind Heart Homestead. My name is Ben and I'm on our off-grid property up in the mountains of Virginia. I'm standing out in front of our shipping container because I need to go in there and get some materials for our trim project in the solar shed. Let me take you in there and show you what we have. It's a bit packed in here because I had to move a lot of stuff in here when we experienced the remnants of the hurricane that hit exactly our top of the mountain here. Well, behind me is a big stack of pre-primed 1x4s. And if you recall from our last video, that's what I used for the trim all around the bathroom window. And I did have to do some ripping there because of the funky nature of that unique window being so close to the corner. I'm gonna start out with the door because that's going to be the easiest thing. The front door already has the jamb. It came with it. So all I have to do is the casing. So that's going to be 3 pieces, the left side, the right side, and the top. And I'm not going to have to rip those because there's plenty of space between the corner of the room and the door. So I'm going to start with those and we'll see what else we get done. So I hope you stick around and I'll be right back. Thanks. I successfully completed the door trims with the exception of the final paint. Now it's time to move on to the big windows in the living area. These 3 windows are the same size, but the overflow from the window and door spray foam that I used is sticking into the cavity that I need to use for the trim. So I need to figure out how to cut this foam out. I'm sure a razor blade would work, but it's probably going to take a lot of effort. So I think I'm just going to use a power tool. I have my oscillating tool, which cuts wood just fine, so foam should be no problem for it. I am worried a bit about the mess. Because this is a furnished space, I'm going to try to use my vacuum with the oscillating tool. So let's see how it goes. These stock 1x4s came with a standard 3.5-inch measurement, which I had to reduce to 3.25 to fit the depth of my window as it recesses into the 2x4 framing. All of these happen to be the same, so I'm ripping them in bulk. Now it's time to cut them to length. Using my table saw, I ripped 2 full 8-foot boards to the appropriate depth. And now it's time to cut them to length. According to my calculations, I can get a long piece and a short piece out of each full-length board. When I say long pieces, I mean the sides of the window, because the windows are tall and skinny, and then the short pieces being the top and the bottom. Since the windows are symmetrical, my 2 top pieces should be identical and my 2 bottom pieces should be identical. So anytime you see me stack boards on the saw like this, it's usually to replicate my cut to make sure that there's 2 pieces the exact same length. There's the 2 long pieces that I just set off to the side, and now I'm using the cutoff pieces to make sure that I have 2 identical short pieces. Now that you've seen the process, I'm speeding this up to show you a time lapse of how I'm cutting the boards for the other 2 windows. I'm using the exact same technique where I lay the boards on top of each other to make identical cuts. Once again, here is the cutting for the 3rd window. I'm pretty confident about the measurements that I took, which is why I went ahead and cut all the boards for the 3 windows. But here is what I call a friction fit, where I'm putting the pieces in place just as a proof of concept to make sure that they're all the proper depth and length, and everything kind of looks pretty good. The reveals on the sides are not necessarily the same. That's because I haven't added the shims yet. But after I pre-assemble this outside on the Gorilla Cart, you'll see that I'm going to bring it back in and actually use shims to control the reveal. I'm using the Gorilla Cart here because I do not have a flat surface. Ideally, I'd have some sort of big piece of plywood on some sawhorses that I could clamp this to. Maybe I could even use pocket holes and a jig to make sure everything is glued and screwed tight before I bring it in. But in this case, this is just the best I can do. I'm using my finger to feel that the 2 surfaces match, and then I'm putting in 2 finished nails per corner. And these finished nails, I believe, are about 2 inches long, so they should have plenty of holding power, and they only really need to hold while I walk the 20 feet into the shed to fit these into the actual windows. So now that I have the first window jamb assembly, I'm using my friction fit approach. The top and the bottom touch the framing, and that's what gives it the friction to not fall out. But as you can see, the left and the right have a bit of wiggle room, and that's perfect because that's where I'm going to add the shims. I'm using a level to make sure the top and bottom pieces are horizontal and the left and right pieces are vertical. But I already did that in the framing process, so I'm really just refining the reveal. And what I mean by a reveal is the visible vinyl that goes around the perimeter of the window. The wood covers most of that, but it's up to you how much of it you actually want to cover. So when you're looking at your reveal, you want the left and the right to match. The top and the bottom don't necessarily match because the bottom reveal comes from the manufacturer much deeper than the top reveal. And I think that's because people tend to use 2x material for their windowsill. At our last house, we did a renovation project in the bathroom, and I used a 2x6 as the windowsill. Here, we're just using the same 1x material that we're using for the rest of the trim, so the reveal is actually a bit different on the bottom. So as I continue this process onto the other 2 windows, I'm using the level, but I'm also just using my eye to make sure that the reveals look as consistent as possible from the left to the right. So back to my portable workbench, also known as the Gorilla Cart, I'm moving on to the 3rd and final window. I got the jamb put together with my finishing nail gun, and now it's just a matter of shimming to control the reveal, the same process that I've done for the other 2 windows. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that I'm also using the nail gun to secure the jamb to the actual 2x4 framing. And there's a couple different ways to do this. I would say most people tend to shoot their finishing nails straight through the shim. That way when you cut the shim off, the shim is not likely to fall. What I prefer to do is to put a nail just above and below the shim in case I need to adjust the shim later, or actually remove it. So now that the 3 window jambs are in place, it's time to move on to the casing. And just like the jambs, I'm cutting these 2 at a time. These 8-foot boards will make a long and a short piece, the long pieces being the sides and the short pieces being the top and the bottom. The dimensions for these, though, are pretty different than they were for the jambs. Because the casing is going to be flush on the drywall, you actually need to project it out beyond just the footprint of the window. Let me show you what I mean. You can see these long ones pretty much just go from the top jamb to the bottom jamb. And then I'm going to take a final measurement from the outside edge of both of these pieces of trim, and then I'm going to add 2 inches to that. So my top and bottom pieces will actually project out an extra inch on the sides beyond the vertical pieces. So now moving on to the last few cuts. These will be the top and bottom trim pieces that will act as the casing of the windows. Like I said, these are going to project out an extra inch in both directions beyond the side casings. And now you'll get to see how these actually look. There's a number of stylistic choices you could do with this. You can make it into a compound trim by adding quarter rounds or different types of milled lumber above this, or I could have cut these at an angle other than 90 degrees to make it look a bit more interesting. But because this is my first time doing this, and this is just a shed, I'm just trying to make it as simple as possible. Once all the nailing is done, I am going back around and using wood filler on every single hole. Even though the finish nails have a barely noticeable head, it is a different color, and I'd like to fill that gap with something that's going to somewhat resemble wood. After that, I'm going to wipe off the excess wood filler with a wet paper towel. The instructions actually say to leave the excess wood filler and sand it off later. That way it doesn't suck down into a little dimple. I personally don't mind the dimple. I'm going for more of a farmhouse, more rustic vibe anyway, so I'm not necessarily worried about the condition of the wood and the texture and things like that, like I would be if this was a super modern kitchen or bathroom. So I'm quickly going through cleaning off the rest of the wood filler so that I can move on to priming. Even though these are pre-primed boards, I do prefer to put a bit of primer over each of these nail holes where the wood filler is wood colored. I also need to cover all of the end grain cuts while I have the primer out. I should have done this while I was cutting, but I didn't feel like getting the paint supplies out at that time. Using this 6-inch putty knife, it's actually not that messy of a job. I'm also using a sponge brush, and the paint tends not to drip as much from that anyway. So here I am repeating the process, priming every single nail hole and end grain that I can find, and then it's finally time for the paintable caulk. I actually really enjoy the detail work when it comes to trim, and the paintable caulk, I would say, is pretty technical in that it's a lot of repetition, a lot of confined spaces, but it also has a huge impact for the visual appeal of the entire window system. I have a bit of a routine I like to do when it comes to the painter's caulk. I like to start closest to the glass and work my way out towards the drywall. That way I'm never working over the wet material, which reduces the risk of getting the silicone all over my clothes and my fingers. I'm actually not really sure if I'm supposed to paint before or after I do the paintable silicone. But in this case, since these boards are pre-primed, I figured it wouldn't hurt to go ahead and do this step, especially because I don't know exactly when I'm going to get around to painting, and I would like this to look as complete as possible in the meantime. I'll repeat this process for each of the windows in this room. My order of operations is to first seal the vinyl of the window to the window jamb, then seal the corners of the window jamb to themselves, then seal the window jamb to the window casing, and then finally the window casing to the finished drywall. That's the one part that I'm a bit nervous about. Since the walls are already painted, I really don't want to make a huge mess. And that's exactly why I'm going to save that part of the process for later, when I have the baseboards in and I actually have more stuff that I need to seal. Obviously, things have been taking shape in here for about a year, but this was the last step in concealing the last remaining exposed framing, and it looks really nice. I'm going to hold off on painting this for a while because I still have to add the baseboards. I'm not sure if I'll make a video about that or not, but let me know down in the comments if you want more content. This has the silicone painter's caulk in all of the seams. That really pulls everything together and gives it a nice finished look. We love this space. It looks great. These pre-primed boards aren't as glossy as they'll be when they're finally painted, but it still looks great. Started putting some decor up on the walls. We use this area mainly for laundry and for dining purposes because we're in a bit of a heat wave right now, and this is our only air-conditioned space. You can see the mini split running in the background. Very quiet. It's set to 80 degrees in here, but it's really closer to like 73. I'm not sure how to explain that disparity. That just seems to be how it works. Maybe it's too powerful for the space. But I am planning to put some vents in through the wall to the bathroom and through the wall to the utility room so that those two rooms can share climate control even when the partition doors are shut. And we do like to keep doors shut to prevent cedar from getting into things. Anyway, let's get back on track. I just wanted to thank you guys for watching this series. Who knows if this is the end of it or not. I'm sure you'll see improvements made, maybe on other videos, but if you haven't seen any of this progress yet, I encourage you to go back and watch from the beginning. It's been a year, and at this point, I'm actually uploading videos of work that I've done that same week. I'm not really queuing things up like I used to. Go ahead and subscribe. I'll see you next time back here on Kind Heart Homestead. Thanks.